So yeah, we are here for the MCQs, and the MCQs are, it's the first one is the pre-embryonic phase of development includes, and the options are first 2 weeks of intrauterine development, it's first 3 weeks, first 4 weeks, or it's the first 8 weeks. So yeah, I repeat, it's a pre-embryonic phase of development which includes which of the following, that is the first 2, first 3, first 4, or is the first 8 weeks. So yeah, with the answer, if you can tell, the answer is basically, it's a factual question, and the answer here is the first 2 weeks of intrauterine development, that is the pre-embryonic phase of development. So yeah, the pre-embryonic phase of development is basically, it includes the first 2 weeks of the intrauterine development. So yeah, we'll move on to the next question. It's which of the following is not true regarding the opioid intoxication, and the options are hallucination results from the stimulation of kappa receptors, or it's a bronchospasm is due to histamine release, and we have opioid induced acute lung injury is a rare complication of opioid intoxication, or we can have it's a opioid intoxication can be ruled out in absence of meiosis. So yeah, if you can answer this, which of the following is not true regarding the opioid intoxication? I'll just repeat for the last time. It's hallucination which results from the stimulation of kappa cells. It's bronchospasm is due to the histamine release. It's opioid induced acute lung injury is a rare complication, and it's opioid intoxication which can be ruled out in absence of meiosis. So yeah, if you want to answer, I know no one wants to answer this. Okay, answer here is, it's basically in case of opioid intoxication. Opioid intoxication can be ruled out in absence of meiosis it's the right answer. But yeah, generally what we have, meiosis is not a diagnostic factor in this condition. So you have or you won't have, it's like that. So yeah, meiosis is not the diagnostic factor you are having a opioid intoxication. So yeah, other option like hallucination, you will see bronchospasm, opioid induced acute lung injury can be seen. It's a rare complication of opioid intoxication here. So yeah, it's a hallucination, bronchospasm, opioid induced lung injury. Next we have next question. The next question we will move on to, it's like which of the following pairs correctly represents the primary glycosidic bond linkage and the branch point bond linkage in glycogen respectively. And basically it's alpha 1,4,1,6,1,4. So I'll just tell the answer here because I also don't know this. It's like which of the following pairs correctly represent the primarily glycosidic bond linkage and the branch point bond linkage in the glycogen respectively. So I think it's of no use. I will just tell the answer here. It's a biochemistry question, and basically it's alpha 1,4 linkage and alpha 1,6 linkage. That is, we have it's a primary glycosidic bond linkage, and we have a branch point bond linkage in glycogen. That's it. There is no need to. We'll move on to the next one. It's a diabetic patient, that is a type 2 diabetic patient who was recently started on treatment, complaints of frequent urination, fever, burning menstruation. So which of the following drugs is most likely responsible for these symptoms? So if you know the adverse effects, you can just tell. If the options are, it's a dapagliflozin, metformin, glipizin, or it's an elzenite. That is elzenite. So I'll just repeat, it's a type 2 diabetic patient and was recently started on treatment, complaints of urination, fever, burning menstruation. Which of the following is drug most likely responsible for this condition? It's a dapagliflozin, it's a metformin, glipizin, or it's an elzenite. Anyone? Urination, fever, burning menstruation. I think it's, yeah, okay then. Okay, the answer here is A, that is it's a dapagliflozin. So dapagliflozin is the right answer, and it is a clinical scenario which is suggestive of a UTI, that's a urinary tract infection, and it's because of dapagliflozin. Yeah. So yeah. So this is a clinical scenario suggestive of UTI, and these adverse effects occur as a result of dapagliflozin. That is a dapagliflozin use. So yeah. So it's a that's all. It's yeah. Okay, the answer is that dapagliflozin is the adverse effect which causes dehydration, which causes urination, fever, and burning menstruation in case of diabetic patient. So yeah, we'll move on to the next question. Next we have, it's a 24-year-old woman who is anemic and hemoglobin is 6. So which of the following set of changes have occurred in this case compared to the normal? So yeah, it's a 24-year-old, hemoglobin is 6 gram per dl, and she is anemic, by that only can tell. So which of the following set of changes have occurred in this case compared to the normal? So yeah, the options here are, there will be a decrease in arterial PO2 and decrease in mixed venous PO2 and increase in 2,3 DPG. So I repeat, it's a case of 23-year-old hemoglobin is 6, that is it's a anemic patient. So which of the following changes have occurred in this case than the normal? So you have to tell what will happen to the PO2, venous PO2, and it's a 2,3 DPG. So if you know, so anyone would like to know, tell just what happens to the arterial PO2, venous PO2 and 2,3 DPG in case of anemia. So yeah, okay, if we can tell, it's okay. The answer here is D, that is the D is right answer. That is normal. PO2 will be normal in case of anemia and venous PO2 will decrease, and as usual it's a 2,3 DPG will be increasing in this condition. So yeah, oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is reduced in an anemic patient, but the arterial PO2 and oxygen saturation are both normal, and the unloading of oxygen at the tissue level is enhanced by increased level of 2,3 DPG in an anemic patient, because 2,3 DPG causes a right shift of the oxygen hemoglobin. So yeah, basically it's like normal arterial PO2, decrease in mixed venous PO2, and it's a increase in 2,3 DPG in patients of anemia. So we'll move on to the next question. It's which of the following structures does not form the boundary of Hasselbalch's triangle? So you might be knowing in surgery, you might be knowing there is a Hasselbalch triangle. So in Hasselbalch triangle, so which of the following does not form the boundary? Options are, it's an inferior epigastric artery, vas deferens, rectus abdominis, or it's an inguinal ligament. So yeah, it's an easy question. So which of the following doesn't form the boundary of Hasselbalch triangle? It's inferior epigastric artery, vas deferens, rectus abdominis, or it's an inguinal ligament. It's a very easy if you know the triangle basically. So yeah, anyone wants to answer this? Okay, the answer I will tell, it's simple only. See, vas deferens won't be there in that case. In Hasselbalch condition, we have the inferior epigastric artery, rectus abdominis, and inguinal ligament. So yeah, laterally it will be inferior epigastric artery, medial it will be inferior, that is the lateral border of rectus abdominis, and inferiorly is the inguinal ligament. So yeah, direct inguinal hernia emerges from the Hasselbalch triangle, and it's in direct inguinal hernia which enters through the deep inguinal rings. Okay, next we move on. So we have a 62-year-old woman who comes with a vaginal bleeding, and yeah, it's a 62-year-old woman who comes with you with vaginal bleeding 11 years after she had attained menopause. So we say it's a postmenopausal bleeding, and endometrial biopsy reveals it's in case of adenocarcinoma. So what is the gold standard method for staging for this condition? Options are MRI, surgery, endometrial biopsy, or it's a PET-CT. Anyone? 11 years after, that is postmenopausal woman with bleeding, and you do a biopsy which reveals adenocarcinoma. So what is the gold standard for this condition? It's MRI, surgery, endometrial biopsy, or a PET scan. So endometrial biopsy has been reveals adenocarcinoma. So yeah, I think it's okay. Okay, now it's very easy. In the given scenario, it's endometrial carcinoma which they have got from the endometrial biopsy, and the gold standard in this condition is surgery. Gold standard method for staging. Basically, they are asking for staging here. So in this condition, it's a staging, that is actually a surgery. So yeah, a total hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy and pelvic and para-aortic lymph node dissection is the standard staging procedure for an endometrial carcinoma. So yeah, option A was MRI, but in MRI it appears to be the best radiographic modality for detecting the myometrial invasion and cervical involvement. So basically the right answer is surgery. So the best mode, that is if you have an endometrial carcinoma, so the best method, that is a gold standard method you have to do here is surgery. Surgery, that is basically you will do a surgery, that is a hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy you will do in this case. So yeah, next we move on. Next we have what is the genetic abnormality seen in patient with synovial sarcoma. So yeah, if you know what is synovial sarcoma, you can just tell. So it's basically what is the genetic abnormality seen in case of synovial sarcoma, and the options are, it's a T1122, TH18, P53 mutation, it's a RB mutation. So yeah, if you can tell, if you know the answers. So okay, which of the genetic abnormalities seen in patients with synovial sarcoma? Yeah, okay, now I will just get the answer. It's up to factual question to remember this. It's like B, that is TH18. It's a chromosomal translocation, that is TH18, and P11Q11. This translocation arises from the SYT-SHX fusion gene, and yeah, it's a misnomer as a tumor does not arise from the synovium, but histological appearance resembles normal synovial tissue. It is an uncommon malignant mesenchymal neoplasm. So yeah, it's a morphologically biphasic, that they nest the epithelioid cells surrounded by the spindle cells. It's a biphasic. So yeah, it's a mesenchymal neoplasm. It's an uncommon malignant mesenchymal neoplasm. Next we move on. We have which of the following criteria is true for safety drinking water according to WHO guidelines. So it's also easy one. It's pH is 6.5 to 8.5. Chlorine is 0.8 gram per dl. It's a nitrate, that is 0.2 gram per dl, or it's a lead, that is 0.1 mg per liter. That is not liter only. So I'll just repeat which of the following criteria is true for safety drinking according to WHO guidelines. It's a pH is 6.5 to 8.5, chloride is 0.8, nitrate 0.2, or it's a lead, that is 0.1. So yeah, if you can tell. Okay. So yeah, the option which is right here, the right option is A, that is pH, that is 6.5 to 8.5 is the right answer. So yeah, a desirable pH according to WHO is 6.5 to 8.5. So yeah, and the maximum chloride you can have it 0.6 gram per liter, nitrates it's like 0.05 gram per liter, and lead should be less than 0.01 mg per liter. So yeah, it's basically what we are discussing is desirable pH in water is 6.5 to 8.5, chloride less than 0.6. So yeah, the next question we have, which of the following is not a genetic anomaly seen in patients with CLL, that is a chronic lymphocytic leukemia, that is chronic lymphocytic lymphoma, or it's a small lymphocytic lymphoma. And the options here are deletion of 11q, trisomy 17p, trisomy 12q, and it's a deletion of 13q. So yeah, if you know, it's a patchwork question, you have to remember this. I will just repeat. It's which of the following is not a genetic anomaly seen in patients with CLL, that is, or small lymphocytic lymphoma. It's a deletion of 11q, trisomy 17p, trisomy 12q, it's a deletion of 13q. So yeah. Okay, we have to remember this. It's a deletion of 17p. That is the right answer is trisomy of 17p. It's which of the following is seen? Yeah, it's seen. Okay, so the option is deletion of that is a 17p is a genetic anomaly seen in CLL, and yeah, it's a trisomy 17p, that only can be tell. So it's a 17p in case of CLL. Next we move on. It's a case 73-year-old woman who presents to you with chronic fatigue and easy bruising. We have done this, I think. It's a case of chronic fatigue and easy bruising. She had a surgery for ovarian cancer 7 years ago along with chemoradiation. So her lab reports reveals pancytopenia and bone marrow biopsy shows the following finding. So yeah, what is the most reliable diagnosis? So basically they have given a pathological image here. I will just tell you what is in the pathological image, and it's a sideroblast. Yeah, it's a sideroblast. Yeah, it's a ring sideroblast which they have given here. And what are ring sideroblasts? Sideroblasts are basically, you know, it's a erythroblast with iron and lead in mitochondria, visible as a perinuclear granules as shown in the below. It's a perinuclear granules as shown in the below. It's a ring sideroblast. So yeah, now you can just tell it's a 73-year-old woman comes to you with chronic fatigue, easy bruising. She has surgery for ovarian cancer 7 years ago along with chemoradiation. So her lab reports reveals a pancytopenia and bone marrow biopsy. So the following finding, that is the sideroblast you can see. So what is the most reliable diagnosis? So yeah, options are aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndrome, it's a acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or it's a myelodysplastic anemia. So yeah, if you understand, it's a aplastic anemia, myelodysplastic syndrome, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or it's a myelodysplastic anemia. So yeah, anyone wants to answer? Okay, the answer here is basically it's B, that is a myelodysplastic syndrome. Why? So basically it's therapy related, because we are giving a treatment here. So because she had a surgery and she had chemoradiation, so it's a therapy related, which we have pancytopenia also, and you have bone marrow sideroblasts. It's a therapy-related myelodysplasia syndrome. So yeah, and what is a myelodysplasia syndrome? You know, it's a group of clonal stem cells disorder characterized by maturation defects associated with ineffective hematopoiesis. So we have two types, primary and secondary. On the basis of age, they are given. It is after 50 years. If it is after 50 years, it's a primary MDS. MDS basically it's a myelodysplasia syndrome, and if it's between the 2 to 8 years, it's basically secondary or therapy-related MDS. So yeah, I will move on to the next question. The question is, by how many weeks of gestation does the optic groove appear? So it's an easy one. So by how many weeks of gestation does the optic groove appear? It's 2 weeks, 3, 4 or 5. So if you can just spell it, it's a 2, 3, 4, 5. You can guess also. Optic groove. So yeah, it's a partial question. You have to know the. Okay, the answer here is 3 weeks. So by how many weeks gestation does the optic groove appear? Optic groove appears is 3 weeks. So yeah. Next we move on. Next we have a case, which of the following statement regarding the milestones is true? It's a child laughs out loud at 5 months. Infant rolling over at 5 months. It's a mouthing is seen at 4 months, or it's a child can turn pages of the book at 11 months. I'll just repeat, which of the following statement is regarding the milestone is true? That is, a child laughs out loud at 5th month, infant rolls at 5 months, mouthing is seen at 4 months, or it's a child can turn pages of 11 of a book at 11 months. So yeah, anyone wants to answer? Okay, the child, normally it's an infant which we are talking here. Infants roll at around 5 to 6 months. So yeah, its answer is B. That is, an infant rolls over 5 months. So yeah, rolling develops between the 4 to 6 months. So yeah, the answer is 5. The approximate they have given. And normally a child laughs at 3 to 4 months and not just 5 months. So yeah, no, so social smile only you can just tell. So it's a child laugh at 3 to 4 months. And mouthing is seen at 6 months and not 4 months as given. And the child can turn the page at 15 months. So have to remember this. It's basically social smile at 3 to 4 months. Then rolling we have it's around 4 to 6 months, and mouthing 6 months, and we have turning the pages at 15 months. So yeah, next we move on. An infant is born with a birth defect as shown in the image below. So it is the most common teratogenic effect of. So they are just asking the adverse effect of this drug. And I will just tell you what the image is. The image is of a spina bifida. Yeah, it's an open type of spina bifida, and just they are asking which is a teratogenic drug which will cause this. So yeah, it's a phenytoin, topiramate, sodium valproate, or it's a phenobarbital. So yeah, if you can just tell, it's okay. I will only tell the answer here is right. Sodium valproate is the right answer here. The sodium valproate is the most common teratogenic drug which will cause spina bifida. So yeah. Phenytoin is also there, but phenytoin is associated with fetal hydantoin syndrome. Topiramate is like it is male fetus, and definitely relationship is lacking, but topiramate you don't see that much. And phenobarbital is similar to phenytoin. So yeah, it's the most common teratogenic drug we have is sodium valproate in the spina bifida case. So yeah, phenytoin, that is fetal hydantoin syndrome. So moving on, it's a woman who comes to you with a positive urine pregnancy test 1 month after taking the MMR vaccine. So at what time of receiving the vaccine she had been advised to avoid conception? What advice do you give her now? Options are wait and watch, termination of pregnancy mandatory, low risk, termination of pregnancy may be considered, or is the high risk of anomaly, serious consideration for termination. So I repeat, it's a woman who presents with positive urine pregnancy test 1 month after taking MMR vaccine. So at the time of receiving the vaccine she had been advised to avoid conception. What advice do you give her now? It's like wait and watch, termination of pregnancy mandatory, low risk, termination of pregnancy may be considered, or the last option is it's a high risk of anomaly, serious consideration for termination. So yeah, basically we are talking about here, it's a woman who is a positive pregnancy test, and that too 1 month after taking the MMR vaccine. But while taking the MMR vaccine she was been told that you should not conceive, but she already conceived. So yeah, now what will you do? It's a wait and watch, termination of pregnancy mandatory, it's a low risk, termination of pregnancy may be considered, or it's a high risk of anomaly, serious consideration for termination from them. So if you can answer this, what can be done? Okay, the answer here is at the wait and watch. So yeah, it's basically 1 month after taking the MMR vaccine. So yeah, it's 1 month after taking the MMR vaccine. If it is within 28 days, you take the that you have taken MMR vaccine, and within 28 days you can conceive. Then only it will be like you have to think about the risk factors. But if it is after 1 month of taking the MMR vaccine, you can conceive. So yeah, in this only the right answer is wait and watch. So you cannot do anything else. So yeah. Next we have it's a easy one. Yeah. What is the first line of treatment of mastitis in lactating mother? So I repeat, what is the first line of treatment of mastitis in lactating mother? And the options are dicloxacillin, cefazolin, ceftriaxone, or it's an ampicillin. So I repeat, it's a dicloxacillin, cefazolin, ceftriaxone, it's an ampicillin. So yeah, if you can answer this. Anyone wants to answer this? What is the first line of treatment of mastitis in a lactating mother? Options were dicloxacillin, cefazolin, ceftriaxone, or it's an ampicillin. So yeah, you can answer this. Mastitis, it's basically inflammation of the mammary gland. Yeah, if you can tell, which is the first line for treatment in lactating mother, they are asking. Okay, the answer only I will only tell the answer. The answer is D. That is, dicloxacillin is basically a drug of choice in case of mastitis in lactating mother. And if it is resistant, you can give penicillin and all that. Yeah, it can give erythromycin also. Erythromycin only when it is penicillin sensitive. Otherwise, you can also give vancomycin, clindamycin and all that. But yeah, you have to remember here is the drug of choice. So the drug of choice for mastitis in a lactating mother is a dicloxacillin. So yeah. Next we have it's a known alcoholic patient who is brought to the emergency in a disoriented state. So he complains of seeing snakes and insects crawling on his skin. So which of the following should be given to this patient? Haloperidol plus thiamine, lodazepam only, it's lodazepam plus thiamine, or it's a haloperidol only. So yeah, if you can tell this answer. So it's just tell me the diagnosis if you know. When an alcoholic patient comes to you, suppose you are in casualty and an alcoholic patient comes to you, that also he has all these things that snakes and insects are crawling over his body or over his skin. So what diagnosis do you think? So yeah. Okay, I will only, also they have given it's in disoriented state. So yeah, okay, I will just write a diagnosis here. It's a condition of delirium tremens. See, when you have you are an alcoholic patient and you suddenly leave alcohol and you stop drinking alcohol, so you will find all these features like you have a disoriented and all that, it will be there. So yeah, it's a acute alcohol withdrawal, and yeah, the right answer is that is C. That is lodazepam plus thiamine is given in case of it's a delirium tremens. So yeah, it's it occurs 2 to 4 days. It occurs 2 to 4 days of abstinence in a heavy alcoholic drinker, and it is characterized by it's an hyperactivity. You will see tremors, delusion, hallucination. You will see in this condition, and it resolves spontaneously in 7 days, but can cause death if a patient has a cardiovascular collapse in this condition. So yeah, so what you will give lorazepam plus thiamine in this case. So yeah, it's a case of delirium tremens which we are talking about. So yeah, haloperidol is generally not the first line of drug, and it might be as an add-on, but it is not the first line of drug. So you have to give benzodiazepines, and yeah, that's all like that. Yeah, it's a chronic alcohol use. So it's a common thing. When you have a chronic alcohol use, you will think of vitamin deficiency, that too thiamine. So you will give thiamine and you will give benzodiazepine. So yeah, the answer is lorazepam plus thiamine in this condition. So match the following. Okay, they have given the food disease, and they have also given the proteins, the structural proteins in that case. So the options are Pemphigus vulgaris, epidermolysis bullosa simplex, it's Pemphigus foliaceus, and it's gentianal epidermolysis bullosa. And the protein they have given is laminin, desmoglein 1, it's K5, K14, it's a desmoglein 3. So you have to basically match the following. I know it's very difficult from just telling you all, so I'll just tell the right answer here. See, I will just match the following. See, in case of a Pemphigus vulgaris, it's basically a desmoglein 3. So you have to remember all the structural proteins in case of which disease we will see. You have to remember that. So yeah, I will just tell it's a Pemphigus vulgaris. It's basically desmoglein 3 structural protein. Then we have it's epidermolysis bullosa simplex, and that you will see K5 K14. Then it's pemphigus foliaceus, and that it is desmoglein 1, and the last one which I told is junctional epidermolysis bullosa, and that is laminin. So it's this, you have to remember it's. And yeah, we all these conditions you know. It's see, pemphigus vulgaris basically it's an autoimmune condition. So yeah, all the autoimmune only, but you have to just remember the structural protein. I will just repeat for the last time. Pemphigus vulgaris desmoglein 3, epidermobullosa simplex is K5 K14, and then we have pemphigus foliaceus is desmoglein 1, and the last is junctional epidermolysis bullosa, which is laminin, structural proteins. So yeah, we move on. It's an CT scan. Yeah. Okay, the question is, school student is brought to the casualty who is unresponsive following trauma to the head. So the NCCT image is shown below. Which drug would you prefer for induction of anesthesia in him? So yeah, okay, you are basically asking for an anesthesiologist, and a school girl comes after trauma to the head. You do a NCCT, and the image is given below. So I'll just tell what it is. Yeah, the image is, it's a extradural hemorrhage. So yeah, just think what is the drug of choice for anesthesia to be given in the case of extradural hemorrhage. So yeah, for induction of anesthesia, and the options are ketamine, halothane, nitrous oxide, or it's a thiopentone. So yeah, if you can tell this answer. Okay, I will tell its answer is D, that is a thiopentone. See, thiopentone is basically preferred in case of any brain injuries because the cerebral blood flow is not compromised in case of thiopentone. In other case, it's like compromise the cerebral blood flow. So yeah, it's a cerebral protective in this case. So yeah, if it's a case of extradural hemorrhage, so what you have to remember, you can just give thiopentone, which is a neuroprotective in this case, and it's an anesthesia. So moving on, it's next question we will move. We have a 8-year-old boy who was referred to an otolaryngologist, and for subjective left-sided hearing loss. A hearing test revealed mild conductive hearing loss at low and middle frequencies. So you do a autoendoscopy, and it shows a mass with an appearance that is shown below. So yeah, so which of the following criteria you use to diagnose this condition? So I will just tell what is the image they have given here. So yeah, you can just tell by the image only what it is. It's a pearly white. Yeah, it's a pearly white mass with an intact eardrum. So eardrum is intact and you have a pearly white mass. That to the anterior superior quadrant. I'll just repeat the question. It's an 8-year-old boy and he has a subjective left-sided hearing loss, and hearing test revealed mild conductive hearing loss, and it's at a low and middle frequencies. So autoendoscopy was done, and autoendoscopy shows there is a pearly white mass behind the intact eardrum. So I'll just tell what it is. It's a diagnosis of congenital. So we are talking about congenital cholesteatoma. So yeah, what you have to tell, which of the following criteria you use to diagnose this condition, that is a congenital cholesteatoma. And the options are, it's a AO-HNS criteria, it's a Levinson criteria, it's a Bent and Kuhn criteria, or it's a Taverner criteria. So yeah, if you can tell, what is the criteria for congenital cholesteatoma? I will just repeat, it's a AO-HNS criteria, Levinson criteria, Bent and Kuhn criteria, or it's a Taverner criteria. You have to remember this, there is no choice. So yeah, okay, the answer here is, I think you might not be knowing, it's a B. That is the Levinson criteria is the right answer for congenital cholesteatoma. I'll just tell what it is there. Yeah, it's like that is a white mass is there behind the tympanic membrane, that two normal tympanic membrane. We have the normal pars tensa and pars placida, no history of otorrhea, no history of otological procedure, or episodes of otitis media with effusion should not be considered as an exclusion criteria. So yeah, basically we were talking about congenital cholesteatoma. Next we move on. It's a plastic surgeon performs an upper eyelid reconstruction using a transoconjunctival flap for a patient who underwent a sebaceous gland carcinoma excision. So what is the maximum tissue loss for which primary repair would you have sufficed? It's less than 5%, less than 10%, less than 25%, it's less than 40%. So yeah, it's easy one, not that easy, but yeah. A plastic surgeon is there who performs an upper eyelid reconstruction using a tarsoconjunctival flap for a patient who underwent a sebaceous gland carcinoma excision. So basically the question is, what is the maximum tissue loss for which a primary repair would have sufficed? And the options are 5%, less than 5%, less than 10%, less than 25%, or it's less than 40%. So yeah. So yeah, the answer is there is less than 25% is the right answer here. Defects compromising, that is less than 25% of the upper eyelid, and generally be closed primarily in the pentagonal approximating fashion. So yeah, if it's a 25 to 50% of the upper eyelid, lateral cantotomy and contortion can be performed. So yeah, so what is the maximum tissue loss for which a primary repair would have sufficed? Defects more than 50% needs a proper flap cover. So yeah, what we have decided is the less than 25%, and we have a transconjunctival flap for a patient. Let's move on. For it's following an outbreak of a disease, you are asked to calculate the secondary attack rate, that is SAR. So what is the denominator used? It's a basically formula for this. I'll just tell the options. All people have an history of contact with the case. It's all people susceptible in the entire area, or it's all the people in contact with the primary case, or it's all the close or exposed contacts that are susceptible. So yeah, you can just tell. Okay, I will just tell the answer here. It's a secondary attack rate which we are talking about. So basically we are talking about secondary attack rate, and it's a PSM question. So they are just asking what is the denominator you can use for SAR, that is the secondary attack rate. And the option is it's all the close or exposed contact that are susceptible. So you have to remember that there is a formula for SAR which you know, and that formula only we are using it. The formula is basically it's a number of exposed or susceptible persons developing the disease within the incubation period into 100 by total number of close or exposed contacts that are susceptible. So yeah, it's basically it's a PSM question, so don't need to think that much. So yeah, next we have it's a Biogram question. So yeah, next we have the elimination rate constant of a drug is 0.05 per hour. So what is the half-life? Option is 20.8, 6.9, 13.8, or it's a 9.8. So elimination rate is 0.05 per hour. So what is the half-life? Here it's a 0 order kinetics, I think, and 0.05 is like I will just see the formula here. So your half-life is 13.8 hours, and it is taken for the plasma concentration to be reduced by 50%. That you know what is half-life. So elimination rate or K value of the drug reflects the fraction of drug removed. So yeah, just okay. So whenever they give you like this, it's a easy one. So you have to remember whenever the question doesn't have which kinetic it is, you have to remember it's a first order kinetics. So in this case they have given it's the elimination rate constant, they have given it is 0.05 hour per hour they have given, and they are asking what is the half-life. So basically you have to tell it as a first order kinetics, and the formula is this KTF is equal to 0.69 and TF is equal to 0.693 by K. So it's like 13.8 in this case. Therefore half-life is that way, it is 13.8 hours. So next we move on. It's a 30-year-old man who comes to you with a history of fever and chest pain for the last 7 days. So a chest X-ray was done. What is the probable diagnosis? Loculated pleural effusion, pneumothorax, consolidation, and it's a fibrosis. I just repeat, it's a 30-year-old man who comes to you with a history of fever and chest pain for the last 7 days. So I will just repeat the question. The question is basically it's a 30-year-old man who comes to you with a history of fever and chest pain for the last 7 days. So a chest X-ray you do, and what is the probable diagnosis? So yeah, I will just tell what is there in the chest X-ray. You can just tell a diagnosis from that only. So it's it's an answer only. Okay, the answer is basically it's a case of pleural effusion only. So yeah, it's a 30-year-old man who comes to you with a history of fever and chest pain for the last 7 days, and the chest X-ray you do. So what is the probable diagnosis in this condition? It's a loculated pleural effusion, pneumothorax, consolidation, or it's a fibrosis. And by looking at the X-ray only, you can just tell it's a case of a pleural effusion, that too loculated. Why? See, in X-ray findings, what you will get a obliteration of the right costophrenic angle, and that you know what you see in pleural effusion. I know there is no need to tell all that. So yeah, last question for today. It's like which of the following drugs is a selective myosin activator, and the options are is tyrosine omecamtiv mecarbil. It's a carpet-guided or it's a milrinone. I will just repeat, which of the following drugs is a selective myosin activator? It's tyrosine omecamtiv mecarbil, or it's a carpet-guided, or it's a milrinone. So yeah. Okay, see, it's basically it has been recently approved for use of patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. So the option says it's a omecamtiv mecarbil. So omecamtiv mecarbil is a selective myosin activator, and it activates cardiac myosin basically and prolongs systole without increasing the oxygen consumption of the heart. So yeah, so we completed the MCQs for today. So yeah, thank you so much for joining.